In the summer of 986, a man named Bjarni Hurlofsson was blown off course on his way to Greenland. He set eyes upon a mountainous land full of tall trees. This was North America. He did not set foot on this land, but he made his way back to Greenland and told the tales of the land he had seen. This rich land piqued the interest of the Norse Greenlanders who lacked timber of their own, especially the interest of a man named Leif Erikson, whom decided this was a land worth exploring. Leif wished for the upcoming voyage that his father, Eric the Red, should lead the expedition. At first, Eric did not want to, saying that he was too old in years and could not stand the hardships of the sea. But later, he gave in to Leif's request. But on the way to the longship, Eric fell from his horse, injuring himself. Eric took this as an omen and now refused to go, so command of the voyage now fell to his son, Leif Erikson. Leif, who was a tall and strong man, now set sail with 35 others on the longship brought from Bjarni the merchant. After days of northeasterly sailing, they came across an inhospitable land covered with ice and mountains. We now think this land was Baffin Island. Eric named this place Helluland, which translates from Old Norse to Land of the Flat Stones. Helluland, Leif knew, was no place for a settlement. According to the sagas of Eric the Red, there was nothing to be found here apart from Arctic foxes. There are some theories which suggest that Leif's party made contact with the native Dorset culture on Baffin Island. These were a nomadic group of people who may have been hunting seals or fishing in the same time period. But there is no solid evidence for this meeting taking place. The Norse conflict with the natives was yet to come.
We're approaching that coastline.
After having no luck with Helluland, Leif's party boarded their boat again and set off back to sea. They sailed and found what contemporary sources think was the coast of Labrador in Canada. The Greenland sagas describe this place as flat and covered in woodland, with white sands on the shore. Leif then named this land Markland, which translates to woodland after the land's qualities. The party likely took timber from Markland to eventually take back to Greenland, which lacked wood of its own. Leif, however, did not think this was an ideal place for a settlement, so his party set off once again, in search for a new home. They sailed according to the sagas for 2 days, before sighting an island which lay to the east of a main block of land. This was to be the colony of Vinland on the island of Newfoundland. They set foot on the island in good weather, and they tasted the dew on the grass, something they said they had never tasted so sweet. After much counsel, Leif and his party decided to winter there. The Greenland saga states that they built houses and that there was no want for salmon in the river or in the lake by their camp. The nature of the island was that the cattle would not need house feeding in the winter, and there was no frost on the ground. That is if the sagas are to be believed. This seemingly warm weather could be down to what is called the medieval warm period, where the planet was a few degrees warmer than it is today, explaining the warm weather for the Vinland settlement and the Norsemen at the time. Another far less accepted theory is that it wasn't actually Newfoundland at all. It was actually a place called Martha's Vineyard near modern-day New York, as the topography of the land matches what is described in the sagas, as well as the wild grapevines growing there. Not only this, but the description in the sagas matches nearby islands and rivers. Interestingly, on a nearby island named No Man's Land, there was evidence of a Nordic runestone with Leif's names carved on it. There was only a few early archaeologists who ever were able to examine it, but today nobody's allowed access to the island due to it being a bird reserve and a Native American important site. So with this, the only piece of evidence is locked away from human eyes, and we may never know how far south the Norse really came. The runestone that was found on the island is submerged by tidal waters, so it can only be seen a few times during the day. This was why it was so difficult to be found in the first place, and so difficult locating it. This piece of evidence, although locked away from human eyes for now, does provide an interesting theory into the Norse exploration of Eastern America. Did they go further than we ever did think? Possibly, but we may never know for now. Before we get our hopes up, The accepted theory still is that Leif's settlement was in Newfoundland. We can only imagine what it must have been like for those in Leif's party to set out so far from home on their longship to a land beyond the edge of the known world, being the first Europeans to set eyes on what was such a rich land with new plants, animals, dense forests, a land that was so similar and yet so different to the ones they had at home. Once Leif's party had finished building their homes and made themselves comfortable, he split the crew into two parts, alternating between one staying at the houses and the other exploring the land, but no further than a day's journey from the camp. The sagas document that on one evening, one of the party, a German named Taikia, went missing. After search parties were sent out, he later returned. He had found grapevines. Leif then took counsel and they decided that he would load their ship with timber and vines, and in the spring they would set off back to Greenland. On the way back, Leif came across some shipwrecked Norse sailors, likely getting lost on their way to Greenland themselves. He rescued them and took them with him back to Greenland, earning himself the nickname Leif the Lucky. This was the end of Leif's voyage, but not the end of Norse exploration into the Americas. Back in Greenland, upon hearing the tales of Leif's journey, his brother Thorvald thought these lands, which had been compared to Valhalla itself, hadn't been explored enough. He took all the advice and direction he could from his brother Leif and set off on a longship with his own party of 30 men. Nothing is known of Thorvald's voyage until they came across Leif's old holdings in Vinland. Thorvald's party wintered at Leif's old settlement, surviving off the plentiful fish in the area. When spring came, they manned their longship and set out westwards to explore new land. We do not know where they went, but they spent 6 months according to the sagas exploring. What they witnessed was vast forested areas and many small islands. All of these lands were very similar, apart from one, where on one of the islands they found a man-made object, a corn shed of wood. It must have been at this moment they realised they were not the only ones in the New World. By the time autumn came, the weather was worsening, and the days growing shorter. Thorvald returned to the relative comfort and safety of Leif's early settlement. Just like before, he and his party wintered there until the spring. Then they set out again, this time exploring lands to the east. Not long into the voyage, disaster struck. A heavy storm hit, nearly sinking their ship, breaking the keel. They made land as soon as they could to repair the ship's keel. Thorvald then named this stretch of land Keelness. After staying here for a time and having repaired their ship, they pushed on and sailed into a firth where they made land. The land stuck out, forming a peninsula, and was covered in trees. Thorvald was so taken by the opportunities of this site, he said this was where he would make his settlement. Shortly after, they looked down onto the beach and saw 3 elevations. They went over to investigate and found that they are actually 3 skin canoes, with 3 Native Americans under each boat. One of the natives ran, and Thorvald and his party fell upon the others, killing all the natives, in what must have been a quick and bloody massacre for the natives. The Norsemen made their way to high ground to assess what their land lay in front of them. Across the bay they saw the dwellings of the Native Americans, what were likely small skin huts. The Norse called these men Squailings, which roughly translates to barbarian, a term first used by the Norse Greenlanders to describe the Thale people, whom they coexisted with in Greenland and likely traded often with, for ivory and fur pelts. For Thorvald though, he must have known his party of only 30 lightly armoured men were in a precarious position, sighting what was now likely a hostile Squaling settlement across the bay. So, they went down to the safety of the beach and made camp there for the night. The next morning the party awoke suddenly to screams and war cries. What they saw was canoes full of Squailings firing arrows and hurling rocks at the party. Thorvald then cried out, "We will put out the battle screen and defend ourselves as well as we can, but fight little against them." The Norsemen likely forming a shield wall to stop the onslaught of the missiles. The Squailings shot at them for a time, but later withdrew in their canoes. In the chaos and the hail of arrows, Thorvald was hit by a Squailing's arrow, pinning him to his longship. He died quickly, surrounded by his men in battle. Thorvald was the only one of his party to be killed, The men later buried him by the shore with a small cross over his grave, as these men were now Christians, not the Odin worshippers of their forefathers. His resting place today remains unknown. The rest of his party made it away safely. You can only imagine what they thought of the Native Americans, how different they looked, how different they sounded, dressed, fought. They must have known and realised then that this land was not going to be easily kept. The party went back to Leif's old settlement, and after a time several colonies on Newfoundland were made. These would be home to generations of Norse families, making their life farming and trading with the Greenland settlers. Vinland relied on its trade with the Norse settlements in Greenland and Iceland, exporting their timber and furs, which were lacking in these other settlements. Boats would head out every season to take the timber to the other settlements. Those voyages would slowly become less and less in time with the decline of the Greenland settlement. Due to Vinland's remoteness and possible native raids, the settlement could never sustain itself and eventually collapsed. With the Greenland settlements disappearing as well due to climate change or native attacks, so too Vinland met the same fate in a similar time period. Greenland was its lifeline to the other outside world. Without it, it was just too far away. Whether the settlers, seeing the end was coming, made their way back to Iceland, or tried to integrate into the Americans, or were just wiped out in some last stand battle with the natives. We will never know. The sagas give no real clue to this, but if it was anything like the collapse in Greenland, it must have been a desperate affair, full of tragedy and one of the great mysteries of Norse culture today. Many people think that Christopher Columbus was the first man to discover the Americas, setting foot on the sandy beaches of the Bahamas, but these Northmen were making journeys to the Americas centuries before Columbus was even born. They were sailors, soldiers and settlers from Norway and Denmark. They were expert shipbuilders, sailors and tellers of epic poetry, known as the sagas, telling tales of warriors and explorers, which is where we get most of our information about these journeys. It is a truly fascinating tale of exploration that deserves to be remembered. The Norse settlers of America. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the next video.